That knot in your stomach when somebody calls you a conspiracy theorist, the flash of embarrassment, that immediate urge to back down and say, never mind, that reflex was not an accident. It wasn't a natural social evolution either. That entire response was engineered. For over 50 years, a single declassified CIA memo has served as the operational playbook for media and government officials to shape public opinion. The goal wasn't to debate the evidence. The goal was to make you feel foolish for looking at it. This isn't a theory. It's a documented strategy. And once you understand what's in that memo, you'll start seeing its fingerprints on everything. The phrase conspiracy theory wasn't invented by the CIA. The term has been around since the 1800s. Its first documented use was in a letter to the New York Times, published January 11th, 1863. Written by Charles Astor Bristed, a Yale-educated writer discussing a suspected plot by British elites to support the Confederacy during the Civil War. He wasn't fringe, and the phrase wasn't an insult. It was a descriptor, neutral, like economic theory, a straightforward way to name a claim that involved a group conspiring in secret. Language is a battlefield, and we see a lot of that today. And while the term had begun to carry some negative weight, by the mid-20th century, the 1960s were about to supercharge it entirely. A neutral phrase was about to be sharpened into one of the most effective tools of social control in modern history. And the catalyst was one of the most jarring events America has ever seen. November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The nation is stunned. The government's official investigation, the Warren Commission, concluded that a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted alone. But the American public wasn't buying it. From the day the Warren Commission published its findings, nearly half the country, and in some polls a majority, rejected the lone gunman conclusion. The evidence felt thin. There were too many stones left unturned. The conclusion felt rushed, and there seemed to be a narrative that went with it. Independent researchers began picking apart the official report publicly, pointing out inconsistencies the commission had failed to address. For the Central Intelligence Agency, this wasn't just a PR headache. It was a crisis of institutional legitimacy. Public trust in major institutions was collapsing, and the CIA was directly in the crosshairs of that skepticism. They needed a way to manage the story, not by engaging with the evidence, but by neutralizing the people asking questions about it. So they drafted a plan, not to directly combat any of the criticism, but particularly to point the finger. On April 1st, 1967, the CIA sent a classified dispatch to its stations and media contacts worldwide. It was titled Countering Criticism of the Warren Report. This document, CIA Dispatch 1035-960, declassified in 1976 and publicly available for nearly 50 years, is the smoking gun. It is the literal operational blueprint for shutting down dissent without ever having to engage with it on its own merits. The memo is direct. It opens by citing its own polling problem. Nearly 46% of the American public did not believe Oswald acted alone. That number, the CIA noted, was a threat. The dispatch then lays out a precise strategy for media contacts. Journalists and opinion leaders the agencies had spent years cultivating relationships with, instructing them on how to counter critics publicly. It provided specific talking points that a conspiracy of that scale would be impossible to keep secret, that no significant new evidence had emerged. But the real architecture of the memo wasn't in its arguments. It was in its tactics of personal destruction. The dispatch explicitly instructed assets to portray critics as irrational, financially motivated, politically biased, and in the exact framing used, infatuated with their own theories. They didn't invent the phrase, they made it a weapon. The CIA wasn't trying to win the argument on evidence. They were trying to make having the argument socially unacceptable. Dispatch 1035-960 was at its core a guide to psychological influence at scale. It took the growing defamatory sense of conspiracy theory and poured accelerant on it, helping to fuse the phrase with connotations of paranoia, instability, and shame. Who you can make fear, you can control. It gave media outlets a coordinated playbook. From that point forward, questioning an official narrative didn't just mark you as a skeptic or a researcher or an American citizen with the First Amendment. It risked getting you branded. And that brand was specifically designed to trigger dismissal, not debate. In 1961, 6 years before the memo was even written, psychologist Robert J. Lifton documented what he called thought-stopping cliches, loaded phrases so socially charged they bypass critical evaluation entirely. They don't require a counter-argument. They short-circuit the conversation before it can even begin. The CIA deployed one at scale 6 years before academics even had a formal name for the mechanisms. And the mechanism worked exactly as designed. In 2018, a study published in the European Journal of Social Psychology found that the labels conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist are formally associated with anticipated social stigma. The specific factors were the negative effects that had, even if they had concrete evidence of fact. The negative associated around that branding greatly affected them, specifically triggering people's fear of social exclusion. People don't just reject the label, they preemptively self-censor to avoid earning it. The programming runs so deep it no longer requires anyone to actively enforce it. Actually, you see this social politics happening all over the place. You hear the label, your critical faculty switch off, the person is branded. Their arguments are tainted. Anyone nearby is socially conditioned to step back for fear of being branded themselves. For over 50 years, this has been one of the most effective mechanisms for managing public perception and discouraging inquiry into the actions of powerful institutions. If you're finding this as interesting as I am, go ahead and subscribe, because understanding the memo is only one of the first layers. Next, we have to look at the infrastructure that was already in place. The system that made this strategy so devastatingly effective the moment it was deployed. The CIA didn't send Dispatch 1035-960 out and hope the media would cooperate. The infrastructure to ensure cooperation had already been built over the previous 2 decades. Starting in the late 1940s, the CIA ran a covert campaign to cultivate relationships with journalists and editors at influential American news organizations, building a network of media assets who could be relied upon to shape narratives when it mattered. This program would later become known as Operation Mockingbird. In 1975, the Church Committee, a landmark Senate investigation led by Senator Frank Church, began publicly exposing the scale of what U.S. intelligence agencies had actually been doing in the dark. The findings were bombshells. The committee officially confirmed CIA plots to assassinate foreign leaders. It confirmed the FBI's methods of intel gathering. Years of surveillance confirmed the NSA's Operation Shamrock, which was mass monitoring of American citizen communications. And it confirmed on the public record that the CIA had cultivated secret relationships with dozens of American journalists, with the full scope of direct hire relationships, as investigative journalist Carl Bernstein later documented in 1977, potentially numbering in the hundreds across major media organizations. What had been dismissed as paranoid speculation was now in the congressional record. The systems of media influence were not a theory. At this point, they were a documented fact. So why does a nearly 60-year-old memo matter today? Because it never stopped working. It is very much alive and well and thriving. Every online argument shut down with "that's just a conspiracy theory." Every line of questioning dismissed without engagement on cable news. Every researcher branded before their evidence gets heard. That's not organic cultural evolution. That's a strategy that became so deeply embedded, it is now self-enforcing. In 2024, an academic paper published in Politics and Governance documented how the conspiracy theory label was systematically misused during the COVID-19 period to shut down inquiry, which is the same playbook, different decade. The infrastructure changes, the mechanisms don't. This is how it sustains itself without active coordination. The memo created a social border between acceptable and unacceptable thought. Cross it, and you risk being pushed outside the serious conversation entirely. No overt censorship required. The fear of ostracism itself does the work. The memo helped engineer a cognitive stop sign, a phrase designed to make you feel embarrassed for even daring to consider that powerful people might conspire in secret. Which, when you actually sit with it and you see some of that stuff going on right now today, is a very strange thing to be called irrational for. The goal was simple. Make sure that when you question the official story, you're the one who looks crazy, not the storytellers. Now you know the playbook, you know where it came from, and you know what it was designed to do. The question it leaves you with is, how does knowing the origin of that embarrassment change the way you experience it? And the next time you hear someone get dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, what will you actually be hearing? What questions will you be asking? And what kind of information are you going to be digging for? Drop it in the comments, because that conversation is exactly what they were trying to prevent.